Hey, this is James with PSP Kingston, coming at you today with another fitness workshop under the general health umbrella. So today's topic that we're going to be talking about under that general health umbrella is kind of on the side of nutrition. We're going to talk about understanding macronutrients. So kind of just give you an overview of this workshop today. We're not going to be really getting into the details of how much of each thing to kind of eat, calorically or in terms of grams of certain things or anything like that, or breaking it down into meals or anything like that. What we're going to be more talking about is the actual macronutrients themselves and getting a better understanding of what they are, how to utilize them, what they do in the body, and then that way you'll be able to give you a better idea of how you can use them to maximize your performance or what you want to do in terms of your goals and your activity level and whatnot. So that's what we're going to cover today, is more so the actual breakdown of what macronutrients are, how to use them, and how they kind of all play together. So that's what we're going to be covering today under our Understanding Macronutrients workshop. So before we get into that, we're going to talk about just the difference there, macro versus micronutrients. So macronutrients are in relation, macro would mean large, so it's any kind of nutrient factor that you have to take into in large quantities, and usually that is in relation to something of like grams and up, right? So you're talking about gram quantities, 30, 40, 50, whatever grams of a certain nutrient would be a macro, vice a micronutrient. So micronutrients come more into play, things less than a gram in the milligram sort of, or even microgram kind of category. And those would be things like vitamins and minerals, right? So you're talking your vitamins A's, B's, and then minerals, like sodium, potassium, phosphorus, stuff like that, right? So those are micronutrients, things that are in very, very small quantities that your body needs. That's not what we're going to be talking about today, but those are your two classifications of nutrients. So you have your macronutrients, your micronutrients, and we're going to be talking about the macronutrients, the ones that you need in those larger quantities. So from the board, you can see there's 4 primary macronutrients that kind of fall in. So you have an often forgotten one. You have water is actually classified as a macronutrient because of the quantity you consume. And then you also have a carbohydrates, fats, and protein. So those are your 4 major ones that you're kind of going to look at. So we're going to touch on each one of those 4 and kind of talk about how they work out. So the first one we'll kind of get out of the way and we'll talk about as a macronutrient is water. So water is a little bit of a different macronutrient. Again, it does still count as a macronutrient because you do take in large quantities, right? So you are taking in enough that it would quantify as a large quantity. And we're not going to go into how much you need, but it is a very important and essential nutrient. It's very essential for life. You can't last very long without water. But it's different from the other macronutrients because it doesn't contain any sort of energy, right? So when you're talking energy, you're talking calories, caloric. It doesn't have any caloric value, so it doesn't provide any energy from that stance, but it's essential for life. It's very essential in terms of, or organic structures and cellular structures and whatnot. So water does count as a macronutrient. It's very important, but it doesn't actually provide energy. So it's a little bit outside of some of the other macros we're going to talk about here in terms of how they affect performance and whatnot. But water is still a very, very important factor. So our next macronutrient that we're going to talk about, our first one here is carbohydrates. So, from a very basic standpoint, the one thing to understand is it's a 4 calorie per gram yield, right? So that means that for every gram of carbohydrates that you consume, there would be 4 calories in each one of those grams from an energy perspective. So it's important to kind of understand, what carbohydrates are and how they work. So the big thing to know about carbohydrates is they are kind of the body's primary energy source, especially when you're talking about it from the perspective of physical activity, right? So when you're physically active, especially things that are in the higher threshold of physical activity, carbohydrates are your primary energy source in that context. So that's a very important consideration that that is what your body's using. What that basically breaks down from carbohydrates is glucose, right? So glucose is your body's primary source, and carbohydrates are primarily made up of glucose and are broken down into glucose by the body for that energy. Now, some of it is readily available and absorbed right away. Some of it is stored for later use. So where you actually get that glucose from is very dependent. It depends on the type of carbohydrate you're eating and what state you're in, right? But fundamentally, that's how it breaks down into glucose and is used in your body from a cellular perspective as energy. And that's your primary energy source, especially when you're looking at that higher threshold type of physical activity. So what's important about that is that you want to look at tailoring it to your activity level. So as with any micronutrient or macronutrient, we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, too much or too little will have detrimental effects, right? So too little from the energy perspective, you won't have a lot of energy. And what that usually means from a physiological perspective is, a decrease in performance on a physical activity, and then also your body having to use other energy sources, vice this primary one, to try and be able to match, the energy that your body is consuming. So there's a lot of different biological pathways that happens. But the key thing would be usually because those biological pathways aren't quite as streamlined and efficient as carbohydrates as an energy source, you're going to be tapping into your energy a little bit more. So you're not going to be able to have as much of the energy. It's not quickly as available, and that's going to decrease generally performance when we're looking at that perspective of physical activity. And then, so vice on the other side is tailoring to activity. You don't want to have too much. So again, depending on your activity level and what you're doing and how much, that's the other factor is if you're eating too much, because it has a caloric value and a caloric range, anything that's eaten above or consumed above that activity level kind of threshold is going to be stored, right? So the human body is very efficient at storing energy for later use. That is kind of like a little bit of a catch-22 of human physiology. It's very efficient at storing because from an evolutionary perspective, humans store a lot of energy for later use because of starvation and whatnot that we dealt with in previous times, but not as much of a factor now. But that is what the body is designed to do. So as soon as you go over that threshold of activity level, it does start to store that, and the way it stores that is fat stores in the body, right? So there is a little bit of a storage factor, and endurance athletes usually have a very good understanding of this. Glycogen within the liver and within the muscle cells, that is the other way that your body uses carbohydrates and glucose as an energy source, is it will store some there. But once that's tapped and once your activity level threshold is reached and you don't need any extra energy, it starts to store as fat for later use, which is important, but from this perspective, not so much. So that is kind of that idea of you really need to think about tailoring that carbohydrate intake and how much you consume to the activity level because of this as a primary factor in terms of physical activity energy. So the actual numbers are very varied, we can say. There's a lot of genetic factors that come into play. Certain people can eat more or less, right? So it's definitely something that you'd want to kind of talk to an expert, a nutritionist, someone in the health promotion department, something of that sort, to get a better idea of an actual number, to be able to really kind of tailor that. So that's the big thing about tailoring it to activity levels. You got to find that right number that works for you. So the other thing too, just to quickly talk about the carbohydrate, is primary energy source, but there are different kind of factors in terms of digestion. Now, generally carbohydrates are digested very quickly in comparison to some of the other macronutrients because the breakdown is a lot faster. But there are different levels, right? So you can get right from the very, very quick sources that are almost basically glucose almost broken down that your body's able to absorb very quickly. And what's unique about carbohydrates, you can actually absorb them through your salivatory glands in your mouth. You can absorb it straight from your stomach and then through your intestinal tract, right? So it depends on how much breakdown is needed from that carbohydrate perspective. And that's important from the physical activity perspective as well. So if you need something that's going to absorb really quickly right before, then you just want to find something that is more broken down into that glucose factor. So simple sugars absorb really quickly right through the stomach. They don't have to bypass the intestinal tract. Sometimes you might not want that. You might want something that does last a little bit longer, and then that would be something that is a more complex type of carbohydrate source that requires more breakdown. It's going to pass the stomach and it's going to go to the intestinal tract. But carbohydrates are the only source of macro that's actually able to break down that quickly, that it can actually break down the stomach and go right to the bloodstream from there. All the other macros take more time and they actually require digestion at a later source, right? So they're not readily available, but that is the nature of carbohydrates, and the way they work in the body is because they are that primary energy source, they absorb really quickly generally. So that's an important factor as well. So again, carbohydrates, primary energy source. Now we're going to touch on that next piece, and we're going to look at our next energy source. So carbohydrate, and the next one is fat. So both of those are energy sources, but a little bit different. So fats, from that fundamental standpoint, again, 9 calories per gram is the energy yield, the caloric yield, right? So you get 9 calories per every gram of fat that you eat. So the caloric yield of fat content is higher than carbohydrates, and then also protein. So it is the highest calorically yielding macronutrient that you consume. So there are some considerations with fat. When you're talking about fat, you're looking at more of kind of a secondary energy source for your body. So what that means is it's more in terms of the lower effort kind of activity factors. So you're looking at things that aren't quite as high demand in terms of physical activity. You're talking more long duration things, and mainly just kind of like homeostasis, just kind of sitting and living and breathing, is when your body does tend to kind of move towards fat store. Your body is a smart machine. It recognizes that you don't need that high output factor, the carbohydrates, so it's going to switch to a bit of a different energy source as its primary thing, breaking down fat molecules into an energy source that's able to be used. So fat is an important factor for that, and that is why you do need some fat consumption from a macronutrient perspective for some of those secondary energies. But at the same time, what is an important factor to recognize as well is that your body is also very efficient at utilizing fat stores within the body for that same purpose as dietary intake. So it can take fat that is stored within the body from excess caloric intake from previous times and use that for the same sort of energy source. And it's fairly efficient at doing so. So that's just an important consideration in terms of how lean you are as a person. So if you're someone that has a very low body fat, you may need to intake fat to get some of that secondary energy source, and to make sure that you're not taking away too much from that primary carbohydrate energy source or some of those glucose stores. But if you do have some more of that fat store, you're not as lean of a person, your body fat's a little bit higher, you still will have some of that secondary energy source from your stored body fat within your body. So another key consideration with dietary fat consumption is that it digests very slowly in the body. It takes a long time for the body to break it down, process it, and kind of move it around. And the other thing too is when it is mixed in with other macronutrients, when you are consuming things, it actually slows down the digestion of some of those other factors as well. So that's an important consideration, again, when you're looking at the performance and what you're taking in. If you mix, a high amount of dietary fat with a quick absorbing carbohydrate, and your goal was to get that quick carbohydrate intake, you might actually slow that down a little bit with that fat consumption. So that's an important factor when you're looking, especially at these two top ones, your carbohydrates, your fats, and how they interact, and how you want to kind of use them in certain circumstances. So, for instance, if you really want a fast energy source, you want some carbohydrates that really kind of absorb fast. You want to make sure that you're not mixing that with a high, fat content as well, because that'll actually slow that digestion process down, and you might not absorb that as fast, and you're kind of negating the effect of what you were looking for with that fast carbohydrate source. So that's kind of how those two play together in that perspective of the slower digestion. And so it's just an important thing to keep in mind with your dietary fat consumption. Another key factor that we don't have on the board that dietary fat is very important for, on top of that secondary energy consumption, is it's actually very important for a lot of metabolic functions as well. So that is why you do have to take in a certain amount of dietary fat as well. There was a long time when, the big craze in terms of nutrition was, low fat, staying away from it. The issue with that, again, is it's very important for hormonal functions in the body when it breaks down into some of the cholesterols. And it's also very important from a molecular kind of compound. It does a lot in terms of like cellular biology. So again, if you're not taking enough of that dietary fat and your body's not able to mobilize enough of it, some of those processes start to get a little muddled. And the other key thing too is it is also very important in terms of micronutrients, that a lot of those micronutrients, a lot of vitamins are fat soluble, which means they have to be digested with fat. If there is no fat content to digest them, then your body won't actually absorb those micronutrients, and then you'll have a deficiency in those. So that's another factor when you're talking about fat consumption, dietary fat consumption. But a key factor to consider with fat consumption, and again, this just kind of comes back to the same thing we talked about carbohydrate when you're looking at how much should you intake. Again, we're not going to get into too much of the fine details, but just a general idea. It's very easy to consume much more than you need in terms of fat consumption, and there's a couple reasons for that. So one of the reasons is because it has such a high caloric yield. And so that would just mean that, if you're eating 10 grams of carbohydrates, you're only getting 40 calories from those 10. Vice, if you eat 10 grams of fat, you're getting 90 calories. So you're almost double as many, you're more than double as many caloric yield from the same amount, right? So that's just where it is important to kind of look at those numbers and just realize that you don't need a whole lot of fat from that caloric standpoint, especially considering the fact that the fat is more used in those secondary and low effort activity factors where you're going to be burning less calories overall in terms of that activity, right? So you're actually not going to be burning them up as much overall. So that is where it is an important factor that you don't overdo, and you kind of are mindful of that. The other reason it is very easy to consume too much is that there are a lot of foods that have fat used as an additive, or they're in foods that you don't really realize. And so that kind of plays in again to that lower amount that you need, on top of the fact that they're kind of snuck in there sometimes with things that you don't realize, or the content is a little bit higher than you might kind of take into account, right? So, an example of that, would be if you're eating eggs, right? So eggs are great as protein, but they also do have a very high fat yield content. They're, usually per egg, it's like 5-6 grams of fat, which is a very high number overall. So again, that's just a consideration there, that just a small amount that you're getting from that protein from the egg, you're also getting quite a bit of a fat yield too. And there's other things that will have some fat content in them that will factor in, things like breads and pastas, stuff like that do still have some fat content, and it adds up pretty quick, right? So it is just to say that, when you are kind of looking at dietary practices and how to intake these macronutrients, fat is one that you kind of have to be a little bit more mindful of when you might need to add more or tailor it back a little bit. So that really comes down to like what you're eating and how you're preparing it and stuff like that. So that is just the one talking point there. So again, we've touched off those two, and again, those two are the big ones that kind of factor in when we're talking about energy production within the body. We're looking at carbohydrates and fats, and they're both involved in energy, but kind of in different ways. And so now we're going to shift down, and we're going to move to our last macronutrient here. And our last one we're going to touch on is protein. So protein is a little bit different. The qualities are different from the first two we touched on. So again, just from that general basis, we're looking at that 4 calories per gram of the caloric yield. So again, so every gram of protein you eat has 4 calories within it from that caloric standpoint. But protein is a little bit different from the other two. So when we talked about carbohydrates and fats, we're looking at energy. Protein is not a primary energy source. So even though the grams do have protein within them, that is because if they are needed for energy, that is how much they yield per gram. But your body doesn't fundamentally use protein intake as a energy production from a macro standpoint. So when you're eating protein, you're really not producing it for energy. The only time that you will utilize the energy yield within a gram of protein per se was when you're voided from these other two energy sources. So those are in very particular circumstances, or sometimes there are very particular dietary practices where you get into those sort of situations where you're trying to, and it's a very complex biological process that your body would take, where it's able to take the amino acids from proteins and convert them into a form of glucose that your body's able to use in that simple form for cellular energy. And again, that process is not a per se common one. It only happens in those states where the other two energy sources are not available to the body. So that is to say, this key fundamental difference of protein is that it is not a energy producing macronutrient. So what does it do then is kind of the question. The primary purpose of protein as a macronutrient, why it's so important, is it is important from tissue building perspective. So basically the proteins break down into amino acids, which are the components of the protein, and go to different things to help to build tissues. So the tissues that we're talking about are any of the tissues in the body. So you have some kind of like lesser from the perspective of protein known ones. You're talking about nails, you're talking about hair, you're talking about eyelashes, you're also talking about skin. But the main one that most people kind of associate with protein, and it is the biggest one that it does have to factor into, is muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is comprised of amino acids, and those are created from protein. So that's your primary function there when you're looking at tissue building, is that consumption of the protein. An important topic on protein, we talk about it when we're looking at the macronutrient, is complete versus incomplete protein sources. So again, we talked about how protein is broken down to amino acids. Certain foods contain all of the amino acids that your body needs, the full spectrum. So there's a varied different types of amino acids that break down from protein. So some have all, and some do not have all. So the main difference usually is animal byproducts. So animal byproducts, so you're looking at meats, milks, anything that is the resultant of an animal, always has a complete amino acid profile, so it has all of the amino acids within it. Whereas sources that come from or resulted from organic things that are non-animal based, you're talking about plants. So even when you're looking at breads and pastas, and then directly from plants, fruits and vegetables, those have incomplete amino acid profiles, so they don't have all the amino acids. And that's an important consideration that usually vegans and vegetarians will have to look at if they're consuming and they're trying to get the full. They have to look at what different amino acids are in different foods. So like that's where the combination that usually comes from with vegetarian sources is rice and beans. They have the two different amino acid profiles that when they are combined together, they actually combine to have a complete. So the reason that is important is that from that vegetarian and vegan perspective is if you don't look at those complete amino acid profiles and you're eating foods that are incomplete from an amino acid profile perspective, you might be missing key and important amino acids. There are certain that are actually considered essential amino acids, and some vegetarian sources of protein don't actually have those. So that's where there is that supplementation or combining of different foods to create an actual complete profile for those. So that's an important consideration when you talk about protein, is just looking at a complete versus incomplete amino acid profile. And again, when we're talking about consumption, the big thing with consumption, again, as we talked about with carbohydrates, with fats, is tailoring it to your activity level as well as goals. So the thing with protein that does tend to usually kind of play in is it's either a lot of times people will undereat protein to a certain extent, or they might not get a full complete profile depending on their dietary practices, or people do tend to go into the opposite direction and overeat protein, whether it be goal related or just because of just dietary practices, they eat a lot of meat or animal byproducts. So they kind of end up on both ends of the spectrum, and they have kind of differing effects. So if you're on the low end of the spectrum, you're going to have problems primarily with tissue building. So you're talking about issues with hair, nails, and then primarily like muscle tissue, having issues with the tissue building from that perspective. And then if you're over, what you do end up there is because your body doesn't really have anything to do with those broken down amino acids. Again, same with the carbohydrates when they're overeaten, because there is a caloric yield that the body's able to get from those sources, it's going to store them. And again, it stores them as body fat, and then it releases them when it needs them, in times when there is food not readily available. So that's your body's biological process. When there is a little bit too much, it's going to store it inherently because it has a caloric yield so that the body can use it later on. So that is again where it is important to kind of look at all the different factors and to decide from there what kind of number tailors best to you. So again, that's through consultation with people with a nutritional background, and you'd be looking at a nutritionist, health promotion, someone with that nutrition background that can help you to kind of determine that number. Again, the determining the individual numbers for an individual person is a very complex process, very far outside of the scope of what we're talking about here today. But again, understanding just the way the protein works and what it's important for is important for being able to figure out possibly what kind of number you might want to shoot for. The reason it's also important to speak of from a goal perspective is that comes back to that tissue building perspective and the big tissue we talked about before that it does build, which is muscle tissue. So again, if your goal is to try and increase the muscle tissue size or the the quality of that muscle tissue, that is where you might need a higher amount. And that is also dependent on how much damage you're doing to the muscle tissue. So the key thing there in terms of building muscle tissue and utilizing protein for that source is how much damage is being incurred by the muscle tissue from physical activity or exercise. Sometimes it's more intentional than others. You're trying to actually intentionally create some of that muscle damage to build it back up. That is, weight training and stuff like that is directly correlated to that process. And so that is where if you are starting to create more of that muscle damage, you're going to want to increase, that protein intake in order to maximize that tissue building quality that you're looking for, right? So that would be more of that activity goal perspective from that side is the goal perspective. Vice an individual that might be in a situation where gaining body weight might not be beneficial or as beneficial, right? So you're looking at, people that are in weight class activities like wrestling or an individual that's in a weight class sort of or a weight restricted type activity like running, for instance, where they don't want to gain too much body weight. That would be another factor where, excessive protein in terms of the perspective of tissue building will increase the muscle size and then increase body weight inherently. So, that would be another spot where you might want to tailor it down a bit depending on what you're looking at, right? So, again, that's where you need that consultation with possibly someone that has a little bit more knowledge of that factor to really kind of hone in and find the right number that works for you. Again, we kind of talked that through real quick. We went through all these different things: water, carbohydrates, fats, protein. Those are your 4. So another general topic to kind of cover here, we kind of covered it off a little bit when we were talking, is what makes you gain weight from macronutrients, or like what is it that factors in. So again, as we talked about before, there are a large number of factors that kind of play into that in terms of genetics and lifestyle and physical activity and all sorts of different things. Food choices is another factor as well, but it really does boil down to the macronutrient consumption as a large part. So that's why it is important to understand some of those fundamental components, which ones are for energy, which ones aren't, understanding that all food does have energy potential and your body will store any excess. So that is why it is also very important to tailor your consumption of certain things to your personal needs is a very important factor in terms of weight loss, weight gain, and finding that right weight balance that you're looking for. So again, just to kind of rehash again, we got water as our big one at the top here, non-energy source, but definitely essential to life. We have our carbohydrates, our primary energy source when we're looking at the physical activity perspective. So again, very important to look at tailoring that carbohydrate intake and consumption to your activity level and what you're doing in your goals. And we have that other energy source that we're looking at. We're looking at fats. Again, it's a secondary energy source, so something else that plays in there. But again, more important from the perspective of, like biological components and hormonal components and whatnot. So definitely important to take in, but also something to be mindful of, not overconsumption. And then our last one here, protein. Again, not a primary energy source. So again, you're not, throwing down some protein in the effort of creating energy in your body is not really going to match up to that goal. Mainly we're looking at there from that protein consumption, you want to build tissues in your body, so that's where you're looking at the protein consumption from. And again, very important from the protein perspective is to tailor that protein intake to your activity level and your goals. So again, outside of the scope of this quick little talk here of this fitness workshop is those individual factors. How many grams of carbohydrates should I take in? How many grams of fat? How many grams of protein? Again, there's a very large range of personal factors that really play in there, and there's a lot of experimentation of finding out what works for your body and what doesn't, and kind of figuring out the numbers yourself to a certain extent as well. So, you start with a base point, you kind of play from there. But again, that's very outside of the scope here. The goal, again, and the hope is that from watching this workshop, you have a better understanding of these primarily these 3 different ones, the ones that you're going to be more food consumption, and then how you can kind of use that knowledge to kind of attack things, and when you might want to emphasize more of this, less of this, where you want to kind of put things in depending on what you're looking for in terms of whether you're looking for energy, more tissue building, whether you're looking to slow your digestion down a bit with some fat consumption added into certain things. So again, the goal of this workshop, and hopefully what you take away, is that you have a better understanding of how to utilize those 3 components, your carbohydrates, your fats, and your proteins, those big macro foods, food components, in order to kind of utilize them to the best that you need for your personal goals and your personal choices and your personal preferences. So hopefully that was the big takeaway that you got from this today. And again, if you have any other questions or you want to, look at those numbers a little bit more closely and how to kind of play those things together, great points to start at. The PSP Health Promotion Department is a good resource to utilize as a member. A lot of them have a very strong nutritional background. Some are nutritionists, so they're a very useful resource from that perspective, or to find some other sort of registered nutritionist or something of that sort, someone with a nutritional background who can help you with some of that more personalization of some of the information we got here. So again, our topic today, and hopefully that gave you a little bit better understanding macronutrients. This is James with PSP Kingston. Hopefully that information was helpful for you. And if you have any questions or concerns, let us know in the comments section.
PSP Kingston, the health and wellness provider for the military community.